Mr. Dan Hampton.
Thank you. How do you do? Nice to see you. Hi, everyone. Thank you. After 15 knee operations, sit down. We don't need that.
I'm only worried a little bit about you sitting down in that chair.
Oh, no, yeah, me too. Yeah. How's everyone doing? Huh? Good? It's always a pleasure to be back here at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I got to tell you, before we get started, I was just outside talking with some of the folks, and Joe, you was telling me about when you walk out of here today, walk straight across that little hall or foyer and look at the picture. I played the game for a long time. Today, just 8 minutes ago, this guy told me why it's called the gridiron. If you walk across that foyer, you'll look at this picture. It's at Massillon.
Yep.
And you'll see why it's called the gridiron. So,
does anybody here want to take a stab at why it's called a gridiron? Anybody know? Okay. You know the story? Okay. Back in 1906, the forward pass was allowed for the first time, which you had to, back in he wasn't in the game, but had to be 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. And there was restrictions on where it could be thrown and how it could be thrown and so on. But for the officials' sake, they put these lines both horizontally and vertically so they could see the 5 yards to know if the quarterback was back 5 yards. That became called the grid. And they began to call the game the gridiron. So it was a reflection on the field. And with that,
you learn something every day here at the Hall of Fame.
I think he was more impressed by the fact that the field was called, in Massillon, was called Asylum Field because it was on the grounds of the Hospital for the Mentally Insane. So,
and they wanted Ditka as their mascot, but he would never.
Maybe that was a suggestion you had to be mentally insane to play the game in 1906.
Everybody that comes up to me and goes, "What was it like playing for Ditka? He's nuts." And I say, well, let me put it this way. If I was trying to get him committed, I don't know if I could. But if he was in, I damn sure know I couldn't get him out. Oh, he was great.
Well, you're a great segue to your own story here. So you bring up Mr. Ditka, and for many of you, maybe you're not familiar with the nickname that Dan had throughout his career. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about your career. This guy was a first-round draft pick with the Chicago Bears, and he's one of the very few people who actually played in 3 different decades. Now, he didn't play for 30 years, but his career started in the 70s, played through the 80s, and ended in the 90s, which that in of itself, for the positions he played, is really remarkable to have that length of a career. But that career was also accentuated by multiple Pro Bowl appearances, All-Pro, first and second team All-Pro a number of times. But he also, and this is something that I think to really get a full appreciation of the man, as much as he was recognized for what he did, he would have been recognized even further, but his unselfish play took him out of position often. And I'm going to have Dan talk a little bit about that. But in this 46 defense that the Bears were running, and Buddy Ryan, we're going to talk a little bit about Mike Ditka and Buddy Ryan and that 46 defense. But this was really the guy who epitomized team. He did what he had to do to help the team. And that meant leaving his comfort zone on a number of occasions to the point where it actually probably hurt you in terms of Pro Bowl, All-Pro recognition, because others would be taking a spot that he'd be then double-teamed in a new position. But he was so capable, Ditka and Buddy Ryan felt that that was something they could do, was move him around in this really hybrid defense they created. Now, if you wouldn't mind, Danimal, that's his nickname, Dan the Animal, Danimal. If you could kind of give us a little bit of a background on that Buddy Ryan, Mike Ditka team.
Okay. I appreciate the compliment. You know, by the way, Danimal was a moniker given to me by the one and only John Madden. I was a pretty good player, and you know, back in the 80s, the 2 defensive tackles on the team of the 80s was Randy White and myself. And you know, I've been very, very fortunate to be given a lot of great compliments in my career, but to be on a team with Randy White is special. Randy White was a great player, great player for the Dallas Cowboys. Anyway, his nickname was the Manster. Mm-hmm. And John Madden had done a game of the Cowboys the week prior, and Randy had had a great game, and, you know, the Manster, and blah, blah, blah. And then we played, it was against Tampa Bay, and I think I had 3 sacks and a bunch of tackles and blah, blah, blah. and he's telling Pat Summerall, which is another great story. Pat Summerall, I didn't know it. He played at Arkansas. That's where I went to college. Anyway, he goes, hey, Pat, you know, if Randy White's the master, then this guy, Dan the Animal, we're going to call him Danimal. And you know what? I'm such a dummy. I should have had that name trademarked, because look at the yogurt company Dannon. It's all Danimals now. It would have been worth a fortune. Too many blows to the head right now. But let me just tell you, I see a lot of young people in here, you know, and what Joe was talking about is, you know, the game of football, you know, and I love basketball and baseball. Everything, they're all great. My daughter is a college volleyball player for South Florida down in Tampa. All these sports, they're all great, but football is a little different because everybody in football, I would play an entire year and never touch the ball. Now think about that. You know, everybody hits in baseball, everybody shoots in basketball. I mean, but football, you're reliant on the rest of your team for you to have a certain modicum of success. And that in itself is why everybody has to buy in and sell out. And that means all for one. And I love that. And anyway, I had some great coaches. I didn't start playing until I was in 11th grade. And I was, I played both ways, but I wasn't that good on defense, so they put me in offense. Anyway, by the time I got to college, Jimmy Johnson, the guy you see on Fox TV, you know, he was my defensive coordinator. And even back then, his hair was perfect. But Jimmy had played at Arkansas as a nose tackle, and he said, hey, I want this big gangly kid, Hampton, to play defense. And so I started playing defense. And I realized that for defense to be good, certain guys are going to have to require a lot of attention. And, you know, I got to tell you, you know, on one hand, it's very frustrating to be doubled and triple teamed. But on the other, it's the true, you know, merit of your value. They're telling you how important you are, but why they're blocking you. And I'll never forget Joe Gibbs, the great head coach. He's in the Hall of Fame too.
Yes, he is. Mm-hmm.
Joe Gibbs, we played against the Redskins a lot. They had a good offensive line called the Hogs. And anyway, they would always double me. And I saw him at a banquet about, I don't know, 10 years after I played. And I went up to him and I shook my head. He goes, Dan Hampton. I said, USOB. And he goes, what? And I said, why will you always double me? He said, every Monday, the offensive line coach, Joe Bugle, would come in and he'd say, here's the game plan. He says, we're going to single block everybody, you know, the guard on Hampton, the center on Singletary, and Hampton's going to throw the guard on the ground, hit Riggins at the line of scrimmage. Now it's going to be 2nd and 10. He said, all right, we'll double Hampton. Riggins will hit Singletary at 4 yards and drag him 4 yards. Now it's 2nd and 2. And Gibbs says, that's what we're going to do there. But that's the reason. Now, I was drafted to play defensive tackle. And we had a bunch of guys get hurt, so I played defensive end. And I wound up making all-pro at defensive end. But eventually, they wanted me to play tackle. And that's where I was really at my best. I was Defensive Player of the Year, Pro Football Weekly, Defensive Player of the Year in 82, 84. And yet, the Bears drafted William the Refrigerator Perry. You remember him? Mm-hmm. He couldn't play in, so I moved back to end and finished my career playing left defensive end. But the bottom line was we had a great defense. And to this day, John Madden still says it was the best football team he had ever seen. And I think we were 18-1. We had one bad half. We lost to the Miami Dolphins. We got down in the first quarter of the game, 21-0. But we had one bad quarter, and we still wound up, you know, shutting everybody out in the playoffs in the Super Bowl. So, you know, it was a great ride. It was a great team, but there were so many great parts of it. You know, we had the great, when you drove up today, what did you see hanging on the side of the Hall of Fame? A great, Walter Payton, the great Walter Payton. I played 9 years with Walter, 9 years. And you talk about a man that you would want to exemplify all the positive characteristics and traits that you would want your son or daughter to emulate. He was fantastic. But he was a star, but he was one of us. And there was there were so many times that, other guys on the team would take the star appeal and start thinking that they were special or whatever. Walter never did. And, he played a long time, and he took a amazing pounding. But he was as fine a guy after his 14th year as he was when he got there. And I tell you what, that's the true mark of great character, that you don't let any personal success deter you and change you in any way. You still adhere to the solid beliefs that you have.
Character, that's an important word.
He's just sweet, man. Watching, somebody said that, I think it was in his book, that some of the coaches were watching him, opposing coaches, and they're saying, how are we going to stop him? And they asked the defense coordinator. He goes, I don't know, man. That dude is sweet. And it just kind of got around, but that's the way he was. He was a sweetheart. He really was. His daughter and son I see all the time, and Connie in Chicago quite often. And they're great kids. But he would bring them and, bring them to practice and change their diaper. And I mean, he was an everyday guy, And one day I was doing this is, like maybe his last year, 87 or something like that. I was doing a appearance at like a Sprint phone store or whatever. And this lady comes up and goes, hey, your teammate's out in the parking lot. I said, who? And she goes, Walter. I said, tell him to come in. Everybody go crazy. She goes, no, he can't. He needs to talk to you. So I go out there, and he's in his Lamborghini or whatever it was. I can't fit in him, so I don't keep up with him. But anyway, I leaned down and said, come on in, man. Come on in. He said, I can't. I said, why not? He said, they'd go crazy if he got it. I said, who is it? It was Michael Jackson riding around with him. Like I said, he was a star, but he was just a regular guy. He was a super guy. But, I got to tell you, and nobody is impervious to all the trappings of fame and success. And, I know that, in subsequent years, everybody kind of, wants to make certain folks maybe bigger than what they could have been or what they really were. But I'll tell you this, I played 9 years with him, and every way he was exemplary.
If I can go to the character issue, there's character and there's characters. Walter was obviously character person, but he could also be a clown too. He clowned around a lot. Mike Ditka, Buddy Ryan, you've been asked a million times, I'm sure. The defense that was designed under Buddy Ryan, what was it like having, you have your head coach, who ultimately is making the decisions, yet you have Buddy Ryan, who's a very, very strong personality, has his own feelings about his defense. Was there stress as a defensive player to answer to both masters, if you will?
Wasn't stress, it was hilarious. How many of you in your job would love to be able to tell your boss to go take a flying leap? Everybody, right? Buddy Ryan was given that opportunity. Let me back up. As I said, Joe, this place it's so full of history. And over the years, when I played, I did not know a lot about the Bears. I grew up in Little Rock, and that we don't have a professional team, and so the NFL was like some faraway land, and I didn't really pay attention to it. But over the years, I realized how important, even playing for the Bears. Everybody's got their own favorite team, but playing for the Bears, it was one of the charter franchises. George Halas, he was walking history. Well, I was drafted, and I wanted, and it wasn't special to be a Chicago Bear. In 1979, the Bears were and also ran, and they hadn't won. They'd never been to a Super Bowl. Anyway, they were in the process of being rebuilt by Jim Finks, a guy that's in this Hall of Fame. Anyway, at the end of the day, he did it the old-fashioned way by drafting really good players. And we were building, and by 1982, on defense, we had started, back then there was 28 teams in the league. And it was a big deal for us, our ranking. Like I said, if you don't win, winning is the great deodorant, the great salvation. But if you don't win, if you're the number one defense, at least nobody's going to blame you, right? Well, we started the season off in 1981. We had a great guy by the name of Neil Armstrong, who was the head coach, but our offense was floundering. And even though we started the season off like 25th in the league on defense, throughout the year, I think we went 6-10. But our defense was getting better and better and better. And Dan Fouts, a Hall of Famer, they came into Chicago on a Monday Night Football, and we picked him off like 5 times and sacked him 10. And I mean, our defense was getting better by leaps and bounds. And by the end of the season, it was obvious that George Halas had to get rid of Neil Armstrong. He'd been there 4 years. And Gary Fensick had this wonderful idea. And Alan Page, another Hall of Famer, was in his 15th year, was going to retire. And Fensick went to Alan Page and says, you know what? We need to write a letter to George Halas, because Halas never came around. He left everybody alone, and hey, you're the coach, you coach. But we wanted to get the message across to George Halas that not only were we getting better, but we would be something special if he would just give us a time, because what Buddy Ryan had basically come up with, this very innovative defense to be able to pressure quarterbacks, needed more time. Anyway, so we wrote this letter. Well, Fensick and Page wrote the letter. Alan Page, graduate of Notre Dame, he's now a Superior Court judge in Minnesota. Fensick went to Yale. Of course, they thought we didn't know how to spell words, so they got to write the letter. They're probably right, but anyway. So we all signed the letter, and we didn't know what was going on. And this was like on a Monday, and then Tuesday was a day off. On Wednesday morning, before the last game of the year, everybody's like whispering, and I'm like, what's going on? The door opens, just like this meeting room, and George Halas, at 88 years old, one of his cane came in and asked for all the coaches to leave the room. I'm like, what's going on? And he comes up in front, and he had tears in his eyes, and he pulls a letter out of his pocket, and he said something I don't remember verbatim, but it was something to the extent of, when I started this league 60 years ago, however many years ago it was, he goes, I only dreamed that someday that not only would the players care about the game, but they would care about each other. But he says, this transcends anything I ever dreamed and believed. He says, for you guys to care not only about each other, but about your coaches, enough to implore me to not only step back, take a look at a blanket change, but to address what he has been able to accomplish despite the failures of the overall record in the team. He goes, it's more than I could have ever asked. And he said, today I'm announcing that I'm going to rehire Buddy Ryan and his staff for a 3-year with double the salary or whatever. And we all stood up and clapped. And anyway, it was an amazing moment. Because all the offensive players looked pretty creepy after not, signing any letter from their coach. But Mike Ditka was hired about 8 days later with a defensive team not already intact, but with a 3-year contract, and basically subservient to the owner and not to him. Most football teams, that's one thing. When a new coach comes in, not only does he want control over the personnel, but he wants control over his coaches. Well, Buddy Ryan had autonomy, and he made the most of it. And there was a fist fight in Miami in the locker room, and I mean, he and Ditka went after each other tooth and nail. But it was a dynamic that, hey, I used to work for a lumber yard, and if I broke a concrete block, nobody went nuts, right? But I'm just saying, we played the game like everything mattered, and there was an intensity that I don't know would have ever been possible if we did not have that dynamic. But that being said, Joe, back to your point, that defense only got better and better, and Jim Finks kept drafting guys like Wilbur Marshall and Otis Wilson and Mike Singletary, and we had Richard Dent. At any one time, say the 1985 Super Bowl season, there would be 9 guys on defense that had at least one Pro Bowl berth under their belt. So, Bill Parcells used to laugh and say, you know what makes the Bears good? He says, they're good. He goes, every one of them's a Pro Bowler. And who are you going to block? And if you got great players everywhere, if you can't double somebody, you got a long afternoon. And that's basically what the premise of the 46 was. If they're going to double me, they're going to leave something open for Otis or Wilbur Marshall or maybe a blitzer like Todd Bell or Gary Fensick. So it was a pressure defense that basically brought about the advent of the West Coast offense, which is basically, you do this, we're going to do that. So the game is always evolving, but I was really proud about the fact that I was able to be a part of one of, Ron Jaworski has a book, The 10 Days That Changed the Game.
Yep.
The 46 defense was one of those.
Yeah. And right to that point, Dan, you talk about how tight the team was, and we all know about the Super Bowl shuffle. Remember that before Super Bowl 20?
Don't remind me.
Well, I was going to say, this is important because there is sometimes things are appropriate. The next year, when there was still momentum behind that, you stepped out and said, "No, I really don't want to do that. It's a little too," I think the word was cocky. Is that how you looked at it?
Well, and you know what?
As a musician too.
Well, see, Willie Gault was the guy that dreamed it all up, and it was, and I, in the big picture, I liked it, and it was cool. And for you young folks, YouTube it sometimes. It's really funny, and then the words are great, and it's got a catchy beat. I'm telling you, there's a lot to like about it. But he came to me and he goes, "You got to do this." I said, "No, I don't." And he says, "Why?" And I said, "I'm superstitious." I said, "I've been here 7 years, and we've never had our name mentioned with the Super Bowl in the same sentence. Come on. I'm not going to jinx this." We were like 10 or 11-0 at the time. I'm not jinxing it. Anyway, I said, "God bless you. Do what you want to do, but I'm not going to be a party to it." And you know what? In your family, some people like to have fun. Some people that say, "No, I want to keep my hands on the wheel." I was one of those guys that said, "No, these kids want to do this. Great, 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 great." But Willie goes, "You're the only guy that knows how to play an instrument. You got to be in." I said, "No." But anyway, I didn't want to be a party to it. And yeah, sure, there was that thought in the back of your head, what if we don't win the Super Bowl, then we're going to look like a bunch of idiots. And, that would have been a lot of egg on our face. But the way it all worked out was great. And I got to tell you, there's no other team in the history of the game that knows what it's like to play a season with a soundtrack. At one time, I don't know if anybody here is from Chicago, but at any one time, it was incessantly played on the radio. And when we got to New Orleans, every bar had it playing like around the clock. Boy, Joe, you need to ask some of the New England Patriot players how much they hate that thing.
Right, exactly.
I don't blame them. I'd hate it too.
Well, we're gonna wrap this up and get into some photos ops here in a minute. But you mentioned you were the only one that played an instrument. And then again, for the young people here, this is important to know too. You were in the band in high school, correct? And I wanted to bring that up, but I also had somebody else ask me, "Can you tell us the story about falling out of a tree?"
Yeah, and you know what? And I'm not trying to make this like into a parable, but it's a great story of believing in not only God's greatness and the human body's ability to heal, but just always saying, "Hey, that story about the little engine that says, 'I think I can, I think I can.'" See, I grew up on a farm. And I was like a little Abner. I was big for my age, and I was always getting hurt. I was reckless. And then by the time I got in 5th grade, my dad says, "You're going to play football." So I did not. I was 180 pounds, and I ran like a 10 flat 100. And so they put me at running back, and I'd run for like 400 yards a game. And so I thought, this is great. I'm going to be a football star. And going into the summer before my 7th grade year, the junior high coach had already basically said, "The job's yours, running back." And so, I was doing, what I normally do on the farm, which was playing around in the summer. And we had a tree house. It was about 30 feet off the ground, and I was about 10 feet above that. And one of my neighbors was shooting a BB gun at me, and it's just one of those deals. And I went up to untie the rope that he was swinging on, and I grabbed a branch, and the next thing, and I remember the wind going, shoo, bam, and I hit the ground, just like I'm standing up. And it fractured both the tibia and fibia in both legs, just snapped them off right above the ankle. But my right heel sustained about 70% of the bone was fractured, and they had to go back in and put a plate and about 5 screws in there. and it's still there today. And it broke my left arm in 3 places. Well, anyway, I woke up in the hospital, and the doctor comes in, and he goes, I understand you're like expecting to be a little football star and all that, but you better think about finding a new career. You're going to have a hard time walking, let alone running, because I had to put this plate and you got the 5 screws and blah, blah, blah. So I didn't really know what I was going to do, but I was in a wheelchair for like 5 months. And then when I went back to school, my mom and dad were musically inclined. They wanted us to play an instrument, so I got in the band and I started playing the saxophone. Now, I kept growing, and by the time I was in 10th grade, I was 6'6", 230 pounds, playing the saxophone at halftime while the team's getting the hell beat out of them, okay? And the coach would walk by me and look at me and go, you. But he had asked me, and I told him, I said, the doctor says I can't play. I've got this plate, and I've got the broken bones and all that. And he kept saying, you know what, it's a long time ago. It's been 4 years. You need to come out. Just try it, just try it, just try it. And you know what? My father had died when I was in 8th grade. He died of pancreatic cancer. And, things were tough. And it was one of those deals where my coach said, look, if you ever want to go to college, it's going to be one of those situations. If you want to try to get a scholarship, you've got a great blessing. The good Lord's given you a 6'6" frame. Now, if you want to try to make something of it, we'll do everything we can to help you. And so I thought about it, and I said, you know what? My dad wanted me to play, and maybe he'd like for me to continue. So I went out, and I had swelling and problems and this and that. But you know what? It was almost like once you ride a bicycle, the best part of it was when I was in 5th and 6th grade, it was with the guys, working hard, sweating together, cussing the coach out behind his back. Those are drove you together. And you know what? I just, my 11th grade year, I wasn't very good. But the team had not won a game in 5 years. But this new coach, Bill Reed, who's in the Arkansas and Texas High School Football Hall of Fame, we won 2 games. And then my senior year, I rode motorcycles too, and I had a motorcycle wreck the week before my senior opening, and I fractured my leg and it's a long story. But anyway, we wound up winning 7 games my senior year. Well, I got offered a scholarship by Arkansas, and nobody had ever been offered a scholarship to Jackson. It was the biggest school in the state. It was an air-based school. There's always, 2 years, and then somebody moved, so it's so much fluctuation. They never won. They were never legit. Nobody ever really accomplished anything. And I was one of those guys that, pardon me, I'm sure this is either Ditka or Dent. I apologize. But anyway, the long and short of it was that team went on and won the state championship the next 3 years. So in some small abstract way, I thought that maybe I was a part of it, turning it around. And then when I went to Arkansas, they hadn't been very good. Well, we went to 3 bowl games and was in the top 6 in the nation 3 out of my 4 years. And then, of course, when I got to Chicago. So I guess my overarching point to the young people here today is, always believe that you can accomplish whatever you really, really believe you can. And, don't discount yourself. Everybody thinks somebody else is always so much better and smarter. And no, hard work. You can outwork 90% of the people on the planet. And I remember so many times when I got in the pros, you'd think all these other guys that were all American here and there, they're better than you. No, if you just work hard and you really, really want to try and help the team, whatever sport, whatever your grades, whatever it may be, I mean, you'll be shocked by how successful you can become. Because I'll tell you this, a number of guys I know made it to the pros, wasn't on talent. It was on hard work ethic. And that's one thing that I'd like to leave my kids with. And I got to tell you, it's hard. I got to stay on them. But like I said, my daughter, she's a scholarship athlete, and now I've got my son. He's 11 years old. I've got 7 years of cussing, but I'm going to make him understand. Thank you so much for coming today, ladies and gentlemen.